like that?
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Welcome to our press conference, Why a Private Finance Investment Goal Can't Deliver a Just Energy Transition. My name is Bronwyn Tucker. I'm with Oil Change International, and with me today is Dr. Sindra Sharma of the Pacific Island Climate Action Network. And with apologies because of the road blockages, we are hoping our colleague Dean Bebe from PowerShift Africa will be able to join us as well. We are here to call for public grants in the NCQG on the scale of trillions, and to kill the myth that the just energy transition is an exception, that it can be financed fully or almost fully by the private sector. The truth is that we cannot depend on the private sector to finance a just energy transition. And with that, I will pass it to Sindra.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn. Bula Vinaka, everyone. And I was going to speak briefly about the Pacific priorities and also why we need grant-based finance as well. So actually, the Pacific has been very clear that, and Pacific CSOs as well, our negotiating bloc AOSIS has always articulated the highest possible ambition to ensure that we stay within that 1.5 degree survival limit. It's our survival limit, right? If this new climate finance goal is unable to be delivered without compromise to the truth of equity and justice, then developed countries have deep moral questions to ask themselves, but also will be held accountable as legal obligations are being clarified by courts like the International Court of Justice, where an advisory opinion on climate change is being sought. And others with strong direction have already provided strong direction, like ITLOS, which is the law of the sea, and BBNJ on biodiversity. So we have mechanisms, right? The needs and priorities of developing countries is in the trillions annually and must support climate mitigation, significantly adaptation, loss and damage, and enabling Pacific nations to build resilient, prosperous communities. The finance must be new, predictable, predominantly public grant-based, empowering vulnerable communities to break free from the debt burdens that they're facing and invest in the thriving and well-being of their people and also the people of all developing countries, which would benefit the whole community, right? It should be accessible and prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable, so particularly small islands and least developed countries. And I believe, as Bronwyn may speak to, the level of finance that we're asking is not unfathomable. It is achievable, and there's mechanisms and routes to be able to get that finance without having disaggregated impacts on communities in developed countries. Now, at this COP, you will hear a few things like contributor-based expansion to investment layers. The first would mean that some SIDS end up paying for this climate crisis, which is just, it's a little bit unthinkable. It also means that you have deviated so far from the Convention and Paris Agreement that its structure can be compromised and weakened. And And we have clear articulation within the convention, so Principle 4 of the convention is clear, and so is the Article 9 of the Paris Agreement on what this goal needs to be able to deliver. So it is finance provided from developed to developing countries and centers the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibility. And yesterday at the Earth Information Day, which was really interesting and provides a basis of science, we saw the trajectory of historical emissions. There's no hiding from science, though you may try, but there's no hiding from it. Next, let's go to the very unhelpful destruction of investment layer. And let me tell you from a Pacific context, this is not climate finance for the Pacific. It is just, frankly, it is not. It will not reach us. We struggle with limited access to finance, small domestic capital markets. Our regulatory environments are complex, and we have infrastructural limitations, like transportation, utilities, and connectivity, to name a few, right? We add this to our traditional ownership and cultural practices, which are important to us as stewards of land and sea, which this investment layer would suggest should be opened as collateral for capital access. And even more so, foreign direct investment is not climate finance because it would lead to capital outflows as profits are repatriated, potentially crowding out local businesses and limiting community benefits as well. So it's like reverse flows back to developed countries. And this dependency on external capital will not enhance local economic resilience and will worsen income inequality. So a layered investment model definitely is not for developing countries and certainly is not for small island states due to these complex socioeconomic, environmental, and structural factors that uniquely affect us, but also more broadly developing countries. What is needed is a goal, a single goal that provides significant grant-based and highly concessional climate finance and a realistic mobilization component, noting that on average, each dollar of public investment capitalizes a very limited amount of private capital. And I may add that loans leverage private capital at only a small portion and is not seen as a catalytic instrument. So in scope and majority of climate finance under the 100 billion was delivered as loans, non-concessional loans. So there's questions to be asked there if you want to just replicate a poor model. A layered investment model definitely is not for developing countries, and certainly it's not for SIDS due to these complex issues I've already spoken about. What's needed is a goal that provides significant grant finance and highly concessional climate finance. Thank you.
Thanks, Indra. Pardon me? Would you be able to share those after, or?
No, I didn't say so.
Yeah, I didn't, yeah, sorry. So as we definitely want to make clear that grants are absolutely needed for adaptation and loss and damage. That is without question. We're focusing on the just energy transition today because one of the major tactics the global north governments are using to avoid paying what they owe is the argument that the private sector can cover most of the bill for a just energy transition. And this is not realistic. This is a tried and tested tactic in development finance, in health with the Sustainable Development Goals. We've been hearing promises of crowding in private sector money to public goods for well over 2 decades at this point. And for the energy transition, let alone a just energy transition, this approach is not generating the scale, the distribution, or the quality of funding needed to phase out fossil fuels or to meet the other goals that countries agreed to in the landmark agreement at COP29 last year. So that's doubling renewable energy and tripling energy, or doubling energy efficiency and tripling renewable energy. We know that these are urgent tasks, and we cannot be relying on these broken methods. And so I'm going to unpack that a little bit more on the kind of why this isn't working. And I will say that's even before we go to the human impacts of the terms that private finance even often comes with. And so that's the pieces like debt, letting profits flow mostly to foreign entities, or austerity policies that come with trying to make a more enabling investment environment. But yeah, one thing I want to stress is that this is not because renewable energy is too expensive or that the transition is too expensive. The fossil fuel industry was built on public funding and industrial policy and public subsidies in an era where industrial policy was much more common. But we still see subsidies and massive handouts continue to the fossil fuel industry today at a scale that is much larger than handouts to renewables. And we can see hypocrisy in this because we can see countries like Canada, where I'm from, the US, and the EU turn back towards also industrial policy when our current financial architecture globally denies those tools to countries in the global south. And so in terms of the kind of scale of finance that this kind of business as usual approach is generating, because that really is what the investment goal approach and the mobilization goal approach represent. Right now there's roughly a global finance gap of 5 trillion per year for the energy transition for every year between now and 2030. But beyond this overall shortfall, we can see the largest gaps are outside of the OECD and China, and we see the largest gaps in key sectors like grids and storage, public transit, housing retrofits, support measures for just transition for fossil fuel workers and communities. And so these are key enabling sectors that are needed for an energy transition to be politically acceptable, for it to be just, and also many of the measures that are needed to speed up the scale up of renewable energy. We can't have 100% renewables if the grid is not ready. We see that the surge in global clean energy investment from the last few years has been overwhelmingly limited to OECD countries and China, with low and lower middle income countries that make up 42% of the population, receiving just 7% of investment in 2022. And so to fill these financing gaps, the primary solution that we hear about is billions to trillions. And so basically using a small amount of public money, honestly, sometimes it's millions to trillions, using a very, very small amount of public subsidized finance, not even necessarily grants, and that this will attract 5 times or 7 times the amount of private finance. Those are really common ratios that we see in IEA and IMF reports. But in practice, this is called blended finance, and in practice, this is not bringing, it's on average bringing much closer to 1-to-1, or even less in other contexts. And so continuing to rely on this approach, this was really central to the 100 billion goal and was a big reason for it being really delayed. So continuing to rely on this approach is really not evidence-based and a risk we absolutely can't afford. And so I think this is often really presented as a pragmatic approach, but it really is the opposite. It upends how energy finance is structured in many countries. The OECD and G7 are really an exception, and so you see models from the IEA or IMF that rely on private, and the ones that the rich countries in these negotiations are referencing. We see them suggest that in just a few years, the energy sector should go from less than half the finance coming from the private sector to 60 to 70 per the IEA, or 90% as per the IMF. And so really it's also suggesting a massive change in how things are financed in just a few years. And it also ignores the fact that there are massive amounts of public funding available to global north countries to pay for the transition at home and to pay their fair share for the NCQG. And so we at Oil Change International released research earlier this year showing that rich countries can raise over 5 trillion a year in public funding through measures like cutting their fossil fuel subsidies, adding a tax on extraction to fossil fuels, taxing the super rich, looking at changing rules around the IMF and granting special drawing rights. There's a large toolbox that the Global North countries have available to them, and this is even, we are focused on the sectors that are also driving, the sectors and rules that are driving the climate crisis the most. That 5.3 trillion number is even before looking at things like monetary policy, and other levers that we've seen Global North countries use many times in the last decade to bail out big banks with the financial crisis in 2008, to respond to COVID-19. And so I would say the cap is not even at 5.3 trillion. There really is levers available. And so the excuse that we can't pay for it, that we can't afford it, is detrimental to the NCQG, and it's also driving a lot of the polarization of politics that we see at home in Global North countries. And so, yeah, I will just end by saying this is not charity. It really is a legal and moral responsibility, and we can pay for it. I think at this point, we can open the floor up to questions. Thanks so much. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Oh, and yeah, there's just a microphone coming to you. Oh yeah, we'll go to the gentleman in the front row first.
Can you please stand up? Now it's on. Okay. Given the lame duck governments like the United States and Germany, how can we reach an NCQG with those actors in their current state?
Thank you. That's a good question. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Sorry. That's a good question. So I think with the US, obviously we know the geopolitics around that, but they've always been sort of detractors of ambition, right? So it's nothing new. But what's important to note is that the energy transition is here now. The signal is there, and governments are shifting to that signal, right? In the private sector too, they're shifting to that signal that renewable energy is a future. So investing in that for developed countries is really important as well, to ensure that they can reduce their emissions and enable others to do so through grant-based finance, so that we can all move together, right? And secondly, regardless of what maybe the US does and what signals that may give to other countries, those countries which are part of the Convention and Paris Agreement have an obligation, and they cannot backslide from that obligation if they try. It's a legal obligation, and they must continue to ensure that they provide what's needed. And the NCQG is an important sort of test of how they perform. So we'll be watching extremely closely.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly that I think in addition to being a legal and moral responsibility, I think countries like Canada and our peers are really ignoring also that those reasons, the legal and moral reasons, should be enough, but they're really ignoring some of the geopolitics here as well. And so this is, a cornerstone of the Paris Agreement and of international climate politics. It was the condition that the Paris Agreement was agreed on, that there would be finance and that rich countries would pay their fair share. And we're also living in a time where there is really shifting geopolitics, and I think it's extremely short-sighted to be kind of nickel and diming and really trying to get out off the hook for the NCQG when they could be, looking ahead and building new alliances, showing that they can be a trusted multilateral partner.
Thanks. So I'd like to ask, what are the stakes for a strong outcome at COP29 and for the NCQG, and where do we need to go for COP30 and COP31?
I'll start really briefly and just give a quick thought on COP30. I think a really big opportunity, we can see that Brazil has really been championing a lot of the global financial architecture reform that would make some of the rules around trade and debt and tax fairer, which is behind a lot of the massive worst in history debt crisis that we are seeing. And so I think there's a real opportunity to link that agenda with COP30 and work through the Just Transition Work Program, through the other agreements to try to make sure that we are, after we agree a strong NCQG, are also changing some of the rules that are locking in fossil fuels and making the financial architecture so unfair. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think as we move from this year to looking forward to COP30, 31, as finance is a key catalyst for climate action as well, right, then we'd see the necessity to land a fair and just climate finance goal here, enhancing implementation ambition with the NDCs at COP30, and as Bronwyn said as well, and then at COP31, if there's talk that it may be in Australia, so in that case, there's a lot of responsibility on Australia as well to, if it wants to be a renewable energy powerhouse, then it should also be, reducing fossil fuels or phasing out fossil fuels in an accelerated way, because these things go together hand in hand. And there's a lot to prove as well in terms of ambition, if Australia really has a priority of global good in mind. Thank you.
Yes. Oh, I will stand up now. 1 second. All right. My name is Vogar Seyedov, representing Azerbaijan State News Agency, and my simple question is: since current COP29 is more known as finance COP, the first time we're discussing the contribution of the great powers to the solution of the ongoing climate problems, my question is, to what extent are you optimistic, and what are generally your expectations about the financial part of the issue, which would probably help to address your agenda that you set out? Thank you.
I can start. I think there has been, we really are seeing some really new and strong alliances in the last few years come through to push for things that seem politically difficult. And so you can look to the agreement of the Loss and Damage Fund a few years ago. This year, after years of leadership from the African group in the UNGA, there's been an agreement that's nearly unanimous around the UN Tax Convention. And so we see new groups of countries pushing to kind of change finance rules and make them fairer, to make them aligned with what we need for a livable future where we stay within 1.5 degrees. And so I think I am optimistic. I think there are countries pushing really strongly for the right things. There's a lot of unity. I think we do need to be careful around I think another tactic that we haven't talked about is, I think, trying to shift the focus away from the NCQG, the new climate finance goal, and towards really small side announcements that are voluntary. So things like the carbon markets that were gabbled through yesterday. There's side announcements with the multilateral development banks, and really that are really posing them as silver bullets when they're not offering the grants or terms that are needed. And so I think it's staying really laser focused on the NCQG and the need for public grants, and not letting ourselves be distracted by false finance solutions.
Yeah, thank you. I think Bronwyn said, the same thing I would feel. And I think there is optimism. This process has been 3 years in the making as well. And if we have to be optimistic as well in terms of how we land, because we don't have time for it not to land the way it needs to. And the signals are there as well, right? And within developing countries, I think there's a really strong unity on what's needed. So there's clarity on that as well, which I think would hopefully shift developed countries to understand that what the needs and priorities that we're articulating, again, we're in this framework of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. We need to also abide by that framework we're in. So listening to what's within that, adhering to that, will be good to go. Thank you.
Okay, we are near the end, so we will call it there. Thanks so much for coming, everyone.